Open that south gate, Margaret. Those horses have to be through that gate before 8, and you have no right to block my route.
You've driven 34 horses across my pasture every morning for 3 weeks. Today, you can explain why you need my land so badly.
Daniel Cross stopped. Behind him, 34 horses crowded the narrow trail that cut through Margaret Hale's pasture. For weeks, she had watched the developer use her land like it belonged to him. But that morning, she had closed the only gate that let his herd leave the far side. Not to keep the horses, not for revenge. Because Margaret had finally discovered where that trail actually led, and why Daniel could not afford to lose it. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story has spread. Now, our story begins. At 6:15 every morning, Margaret Hale heard the horses before she saw them. Hooves against hard ground. Bridles clicking. Men calling quietly through the gray morning light. The first time it happened, Margaret thought horses from Cross Ridge had gotten loose. Then all 34 came through the north opening of her pasture in a controlled line. 2 riders followed behind. A utility cart came last. Margaret knew where the animals came from. Before Daniel Cross began building luxury homes on the acreage north of her farm, the property had operated a small equestrian facility. Daniel had kept the existing barn and paddocks active while construction moved around them. What Margaret did not understand was why his entire stable was crossing her land. On the 3rd morning, she waited beside the pasture. Daniel arrived in a dark pickup while his employees moved the horses through. What is this? Temporary detour. Through my pasture? We're repairing drainage and fencing near our usual exercise route. Margaret looked at the horses. They were not wandering. They followed one narrow line across her grass toward the south gate. How temporary? Few days. Margaret had known Daniel for less than a year. His Cross Ridge project promised large homes, private paddocks, and an equestrian lifestyle. What he developed on his acreage was his business. What crossed hers was not. Still, she tolerated the route for several days because Daniel had described it as short-term, and Margaret was not going to create an unsafe situation with 34 horses merely to prove a point. Her temporary patience was not open-ended permission. On the 4th morning, she emailed Daniel and the Cross Ridge stable manager to confirm what had been said. She would allow the existing herd movements for only a few more days while the claimed drainage problem was addressed. No vehicles were authorized beyond the utility cart, no grading or marking could occur, and any continued use would require a written agreement. She saved the message, and Daniel's one-line reply, understood. Temporary only. That exchange mattered later because it fixed the difference between neighborly accommodation and a permanent access right. It also showed that Daniel knew the pasture was Margaret's, even while he was beginning to present the route as part of his project. But the horses kept coming. By the end of the 1st week, the grass showed a visible track. By the 2nd, the trail had widened. 34 horses out every morning and back again later pressed the soil hard enough that Margaret could see the route from her porch. She had managed the farm alone since her husband died 4 years earlier. At 57, she had learned to notice small damage before it became expensive damage. 34 horses crossing twice a day meant 68 sets of hooves pressing the same strip, and repeated traffic after rain could compact the root zone, create channels for runoff, and leave slick footing near the gate. Margaret rotated her own livestock away from the worn line, checked the water point every evening, and photographed the ground from the same fence post so each image could be compared with the last. She was not treating the animals as the enemy. The horses were doing exactly what their handlers asked. Her concern was the person who kept sending them through a working pasture without a route agreement, maintenance plan, insurance certificate, or schedule for repairing the damage. On the 15th morning, she met Daniel beside the north opening. You said a few days. We hit delays. Then use another route. Daniel looked toward the south end of her pasture. It'll be over soon. You never asked permission. I thought we had an understanding. No. I agreed not to stop you for a few days. Daniel's expression tightened. One by one, all 34 horses disappeared through the south gate. Margaret watched the last one leave. That was when something bothered her more than the damaged grass. A temporary detour could have changed as construction changed. This route never did. Every morning it led to exactly the same exit, and Daniel seemed to care about reaching that gate far more than avoiding any construction zone. By the third week, Margaret could no longer pretend the damage was temporary. The line across her pasture had become a trail, not a faint mark, a packed strip nearly 6 feet wide in places. Grass had been worn down to dirt where the horses slowed near the south gate, and hoofprints had cut deeper into the softer ground after 2 nights of rain. Margaret started documenting everything. 6:14 a.m., 34 horses, 2 riders, 1 utility cart. 6:17 a.m., same count, same route. The next morning, a white pickup followed behind them. Margaret stepped into the lane before it reached the middle of the pasture. The driver stopped. Daniel climbed out from the passenger side. What now? Margaret held up her phone. Now I'm recording how often you use my land. Daniel looked at the worn trail. We've been using this route every morning. That doesn't make it yours. I didn't say it did. You're acting like it does. One of the riders called from farther ahead. The horses were beginning to bunch up. Daniel glanced toward them. We don't have time for this. Margaret almost laughed. That seems to be your favorite problem. Daniel's face tightened. Move aside. She did. Not because he had won the argument. Because 34 horses were waiting behind him, and Margaret had no intention of turning her property dispute into an animal handling problem. She watched the herd pass. That was when she noticed the first orange ribbon. It was tied low around a wooden stake beside the trail. Then another. And another. Small survey-style markers continued toward the south gate. Margaret walked to the nearest one. She had not placed it there. Neither had any utility company she knew of. Daniel saw what she was looking at. What are those? You tell me. Probably from the grading crew. Your grading crew is marking inside my pasture? Daniel did not answer immediately. Margaret moved to the next stake. A short code had been written in black marker across the top. CRET04 Daniel. He looked at it. For the first time that morning, he seemed less annoyed than cautious. Those shouldn't bother anything. That's not what I asked. The last horse passed them. Daniel walked back toward his pickup. Margaret called after him. You said this was a temporary detour. It is. Then why is somebody marking it? Daniel opened the truck door. Because people mark routes. What route? He looked at her for a second, then climbed inside without answering. Margaret stood alone beside the orange stakes. The horses had created the trail. Now someone was measuring it. And for the first time, she wondered whether Daniel had ever planned to stop using her pasture at all. Margaret waited until the herd returned that evening. This time, she stood beside the orange stakes. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later in his pickup. He saw her before he reached the gate. What are you doing out here? Margaret pointed at the nearest marker. Waiting for an answer. Daniel stepped out. You already got one. No. You said these were route markers. They are. For what? He looked toward the riders bringing the horses back through the south gate. For safe movement. Margaret folded her arms. Safe movement through my pasture? Daniel's patience thinned. You're turning a small problem into something bigger. Margaret photographed the nearest stake from several angles before lifting it straight out of the ground. She measured its distance from the fence, photographed the hole, and kept the camera running while she examined the code written clearly across the top, CRET04. When she finished, she returned the stake to the same hole. She wanted to identify it, not destroy or relocate someone else's evidence. What does ET stand for? Daniel looked at the stake. He did not answer immediately. Margaret did. Equestrian trail? His eyes shifted. That was enough. She had spent part of the afternoon searching Daniel's development permits and the public documents attached to the county planning file. The records included the project name, preliminary grading sheets, drainage comments, and several concept exhibits. None of the documents she found granted Daniel permission to enter Margaret's parcel, but the initials on the stake matched the project name printed across every Cross Ridge filing. The project north of her farm was officially called Cross Ridge Equestrian Estates. Same initials, same code, same land. Margaret held up the stake. This belongs to your development survey. It's just a field marker. Inside my field, we're mapping possible routes. Margaret stared at him. That's not a temporary detour. Daniel's jaw tightened. Behind them, horses moved through the pasture in pairs. The worn strip beneath their hooves now looked less accidental than ever. Margaret pointed south. Where are they going every morning? Training. Where? Pine Valley. That was the first direct answer he had given her. Pine Valley's public riding trails began beyond the county bridle lane south of Margaret's farm. She knew them well. Her husband had ridden there years earlier. Margaret looked back at Daniel. So your horses cross my pasture to reach Pine Valley. For now. And your survey crew is marking the same route. Daniel sighed. You're reading too much into it. Then explain it. He stepped closer. We're evaluating access options for Cross Ridge. That's all. Access for 34 horses? For the development. The words hung between them. Daniel realized what he had said. Margaret did too. Until that moment, he had described the herd as a temporary inconvenience caused by construction. Now he had connected the route directly to Cross Ridge. You're planning to use my pasture as development access. I said we're evaluating options. Without asking me. No final decision has been made. Margaret looked at the stakes, then at the trail, then at 34 horses walking across land Daniel did not own. Looks like you've already been testing your decision for 3 weeks. Daniel said nothing. He returned to his truck and drove north. Margaret stayed beside the trail after the last horse disappeared. The pasture was no longer the mystery. The route was. And if Cross Ridge needed access through her land, Margaret wanted to know exactly what Daniel was promising on the other side. Margaret found the answer before 8 that night. Cross Ridge Equestrian Estates had a polished website. Aerial photos. Stone entrance signs. Large homes beside fenced paddocks. Every page sold the same idea: privacy, land, horse. Then Margaret opened the amenities section. One line stopped her: direct horseback access to Pine Valley riding trails. She read it twice. Below the sentence was a site map. Cross Ridge sat north of her farm. A thin trail line left the development, moved south, and connected with Pine Valley's public riding system. Margaret enlarged the image. The line crossed exactly where Daniel's horses had been crossing. Her pasture. Her south gate. The same worn route marked with orange stakes. Margaret leaned back from the screen. There was no note saying temporary. No dotted section labeled proposed. No statement that access depended on permission from another landowner. To anyone looking at the brochure, the trail already existed. Margaret saved the web page as a PDF, captured the date and address bar in screenshots, and downloaded the brochure rather than relying on a page Daniel could change overnight. She also saved the listing pages that repeated the access claim. Marketing language was not a deed or an easement, but it could show what buyers were being encouraged to believe and why Daniel kept demonstrating the route with a full herd. She clicked another page. Ride from your property directly into miles of open country. Margaret felt her anger sharpen. Daniel was not simply evaluating a route. He was advertising one. She downloaded the brochure and printed every page that showed the trail. Then she searched the sales listings. 3 homes were already being marketed. One listing described Cross Ridge as offering private equestrian living with immediate trail access. Margaret picked up her phone. Daniel answered quickly. What? I found your brochure. Silence. The one promising direct access to Pine Valley. It's marketing material. It shows a trail through my pasture. It shows the general area. No, it shows a line from Cross Ridge to my south gate. Daniel exhaled. Those maps are conceptual. Then why are 34 horses following the concept every morning? He did not answer. Margaret continued. Why are your survey stakes sitting on the same line? We're still evaluating routes. Your buyers aren't being told that. Daniel's voice hardened. You don't know what buyers are being told. Then maybe I should ask one. Another silence. Longer this time. Margaret, don't interfere with my sales operation. She almost laughed. Then stop using my farm as part of it. Daniel ended the call. Margaret placed the phone beside the brochure. For 3 weeks, he had described the horses as a temporary detour. Now the public sales material described the same path as an amenity. That changed the stakes. Daniel did not merely want a convenient way across her pasture. He needed people to believe Cross Ridge had direct horseback access to Pine Valley. Margaret looked at the printed map again. The line crossed her land as cleanly as if Daniel had drawn ownership along with it. The next morning, she decided she would be waiting when the horses came through. This time, she wanted to see who came with them. At 6:12 the next morning, Margaret was already standing near the south side of the pasture. She heard the horses first. Then engines. Not one, three. The 34 horses came through the north opening in their usual line, but 2 black SUVs followed behind the riders. A white pickup brought up the rear. Margaret stayed beside the fence and watched. 4 people stepped out of the SUVs near the middle of the pasture. Clean boots. New riding jackets. One woman carried a Cross Ridge brochure. A salesperson walked beside them, talking as the horses moved past. Margaret could not hear every word, but she heard enough. Direct connection to Pine Valley. One of the buyers pointed toward the south gate. So this is the private trail connection? The salesperson smiled. That's the route. Margaret stepped closer. Private to whom? Everyone turned. The salesperson's expression changed immediately. Good morning. Margaret looked at the brochure in the buyer's hand. Did they tell you this trail crosses my pasture? The buyer frowned. Your pasture? The salesperson moved quickly. This is part of an access route we're still coordinating. Margaret looked at him. That's not what your brochure says. The second buyer opened his copy. It says direct horseback access. Margaret nodded. It does. The salesperson lowered his voice. Margaret, this really isn't the place. She almost smiled. You brought buyers onto my land. I think that makes it exactly the place. The riders slowed the horses ahead. Daniel's pickup appeared from the north less than a minute later. He got out before the engine fully stopped. What are you doing? Margaret pointed toward the SUVs. I was about to ask you the same thing. Daniel looked at the salesperson, then at the buyers. His face hardened. This group is leaving. One woman held up the brochure. Do you actually have permanent access through here? Daniel answered too quickly. We're finalizing the trail connection. Margaret heard the change. Not we have access. Not this is our trail, finalizing. The buyers heard it too. The man beside her folded his brochure. So it isn't guaranteed? Daniel's jaw tightened. We're working through the final details. Margaret said nothing. She did not need to. The salesperson ushered the group back toward the SUVs. Within minutes, the vehicles turned around and headed north. The horses continued toward the south gate. Daniel stayed behind. You had no reason to interfere. Margaret looked at the worn trail beneath his boots. You brought a sales tour through my pasture without permission. It was 5 minutes. You've been bringing 34 horses through here for 3 weeks. Daniel stepped closer. You're going to cost me sales. Margaret met his eyes. No. I think the route you're selling might do that. For the first time, Daniel did not argue. And Margaret finally understood something important. The horses were not testing a detour. They were demonstrating a promise. Now she needed to know what happened to Cross Ridge if that promise disappeared. That afternoon, Margaret stopped studying Cross Ridge's marketing and started studying the land. She pulled up county parcel maps, topographic layers, and the development's publicly filed site plan. The geography explained more than Daniel had. Cross Ridge sat directly north of her farm. To the west, privately owned parcels blocked any simple connection to the public riding system. Along the north side, a steep drainage ravine cut across part of Daniel's property. To the east, the development bordered a busy highway. There was land there that could potentially support another horse route, but it would require a longer alignment, additional grading, and engineering around the drainage channel before riders could safely reach the bridle network. Then there was Margaret's pasture, flat open, already connected to the county-maintained bridle lane through her south gate. She called Paul Mercer, a local surveyor who had worked around Pine Valley for years. I need you to look at a route. Margaret emailed him the development map. He called back 20 minutes later. You're asking why Cross Ridge keeps going through your pasture. Yes, because yours is the direct connection. The only connection? The only easy one I see. Margaret looked again at the eastern edge. What about that side? They could probably make something work there. So they're not trapped without me. No. But they'd have to build it. Paul explained that an eastern route would likely need more grading, drainage work, and possibly a small engineered crossing where the terrain narrowed. Margaret looked toward the south gate from her kitchen window. And through my pasture? They already have flat ground all the way to the bridle lane. No new structure. No significant grading. No detour around neighboring parcels. Just her grass and one gate. Margaret opened the Cross Ridge brochure again. Direct horseback access to Pine Valley riding trails. Now the wording made sense. Daniel did not need Margaret's land for Cross Ridge to exist. He needed it for the fastest, cheapest, most marketable connection between his development and Pine Valley. That explained the survey stakes. The sales tour. The same 34 horses crossing the same line every morning. And it explained why Daniel never seemed interested in another direction. Margaret studied the route one final time. The horses entered her pasture from the north. Without the south gate, they were not trapped. The riders could turn them around and return safely to Cross Ridge. But they could not continue directly to Pine Valley. For 3 weeks, Daniel had treated that gate as though opening it were part of the landscape. Tomorrow morning, Margaret decided, it would not be. But she did not simply buy a chain and hope the riders noticed in time. She called a local land use attorney named Rebecca Sloan, sent her the deed, title, policy, archived map, brochure, emails, photographs, and Paul's preliminary observations, and explained exactly how the horses entered and left. Rebecca cautioned that property rights could depend on recorded documents and state-specific facts, so Margaret should not make sweeping claims before the title review was complete. She could, however, clearly revoke the temporary permission she had granted and require Daniel to produce whatever right he claimed. Rebecca prepared a written notice stating that permissive use of the pasture would end at 5 that afternoon, the south gate would be locked the following morning, and no Cross Ridge employee, vehicle, buyer, contractor, or horse was authorized to enter afterward without a written agreement or documented legal right. The notice also demanded preservation of route plans, surveys, sales materials, buyer communications, and field instructions. Margaret emailed it to Daniel, the stable manager, the sales office, and Daniel's project attorney, then sent a copy by track delivery. The stable manager acknowledged receipt. Margaret also attached a simple diagram showing that the north opening would remain available for any horses Daniel sent despite the notice. She asked that no herd be brought onto her land, but if the instruction was ignored, the riders would have enough room to turn around safely before reaching the locked gate. She was not going to trap his horses. She was going to remove the shortcut and see how Daniel reacted when the cheapest route in his development ended at a locked gate. At 4:40 that afternoon, Paul Mercer met Margaret beside the north pasture. Before she locked anything, Margaret wanted to know exactly what the old maps showed and what they did not. Paul was not acting as her lawyer, and Margaret did not ask him to declare who had a legal right of passage. His job was narrower: locate the recorded boundary monuments, compare the physical route with the archived survey, and document where the old farm track had been depicted. Rebecca would use that information with the title records and Daniel's documents if the dispute continued. Paul carried an archived survey, a current parcel map, and his field equipment. They followed the worn horse trail south. Halfway across the pasture, Paul stopped. There was an old farm track through here. Margaret felt her confidence tighten. So Daniel didn't invent the whole route. No. Part of it is real. Paul opened the archived survey. A faint dashed line crossed Margaret's property. For several hundred feet, it followed almost the same path the 34 horses had worn into the grass. Then Paul enlarged the southern section. The dashed line ended. Margaret looked toward her gate. That's nearly 200 feet short. About that. So the old track never reached the south gate? Not on this survey. Paul was careful with his words. This tells us where the historic farm track was depicted. It doesn't decide every possible access right. That would require checking the recorded property documents. Margaret nodded. She did not need a dramatic conclusion. She needed facts. A pickup came slowly down the north lane. Daniel stopped when he saw them. He stepped out carrying a rolled plan. "You hired a surveyor?" I hired someone to tell me where the old track actually goes. Daniel unrolled his development plan across the hood of his truck. A line ran from Cross Ridge, through Margaret's pasture and directly to the south gate. There, he said. Existing farm lane. Paul compared the two maps. For part of the distance. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Paul pointed to the archived line. The historic track shown here stops before the south end. Your project drawing continues beyond it. It follows the route that's been used. Margaret looked at him. Used by whom? Daniel hesitated. Our horses have been crossing it. For 3 weeks. Daniel's expression hardened. The connection makes sense. Margaret almost smiled. That isn't the same thing as having the right to use it. Paul rolled up the archived survey. I can confirm the boundary and where this older track is shown. If there's an easement or another recorded access right, that needs to come from the property records. Daniel gathered his plan. You're creating a problem that doesn't need to exist. Margaret looked toward the south gate. No, I'm finally checking whether the solution you chose belongs on my land. Daniel drove away without answering. Paul packed his equipment. You still planning to close the gate tomorrow? Margaret looked at the worn trail, then at the 200 feet Daniel's map had quietly added. Yes. The old farm track explained why his route looked believable. But it did not explain the part Daniel needed most, the connection to her south gate. And tomorrow morning, that missing piece was going to matter. At 5:58 the next morning, Margaret reached the south gate. She threaded a chain through the steel bars and snapped the lock shut. Then she walked 50 yards back up the trail, where the riders would be able to see her before the herd reached the gate. The north entrance remained open. Nothing prevented the horses from turning around and returning to Cross Ridge. Margaret was not trapping anyone. She was closing the connection Daniel had never proved he had the right to use. At 6:15, the first horses appeared, 34. Same riders. Same worn line across the pasture. Margaret raised one hand before the lead horse came within 100 yards of the south gate. The riders slowed immediately. Gates closed? Yes. He looked past her toward the chain. Are we going through? Not today. The rider called back to the second handler. They spread the horses out rather than allowing the herd to bunch near the fence. A few animals shifted sideways, but the riders kept them calm. You want us to turn around? Margaret nodded. You have the entire north side open. Before they moved, an engine came down the lane. Daniel's pickup stopped near the fence. He stepped out quickly. Open that south gate, Margaret. Those horses have to be through that gate before 8, and you have no right to block my route. Margaret looked at him. Your route? You've driven 34 horses across my pasture every morning for 3 weeks. Today you can explain why you need my land so badly. Daniel stopped. Behind him, the riders kept the herd well back from the gate. Margaret held up the Cross Ridge brochure. Direct horseback access to Pine Valley. Daniel's eyes dropped to the page. We've already discussed this. No. You called it a temporary detour. Then you called it an access option. She unfolded Paul's sketch. The historic farm track stops before this gate. Daniel barely glanced at it. That doesn't settle the access question. I know. Margaret pointed toward the locked gate. But you haven't shown me an easement, an agreement, or any other right that lets Cross Ridge continue through here. Daniel looked at the horses, then at the riders. For several seconds, he said nothing. Finally, he turned. Take them back north. The command was controlled. The riders began reversing the herd in small groups, giving the horses room to turn safely. The lead handler had received Margaret's notice from the stable manager and already knew the south gate might be closed. Water and secure paddocks were available back at Cross Ridge, less than a controlled walk away, so the change did not strand the animals without care. The handlers used the open north end exactly as Margaret had planned. Daniel did not touch the chain. He did not produce an easement. He did not tell anyone to force the gate. Margaret watched the last horses head back toward Cross Ridge. Then Daniel lowered his voice. You have no idea what this is going to cost. Margaret held the brochure between them. That's exactly what I'm starting to understand. For 3 weeks, Daniel had treated the south gate as automatic. That morning, the route stopped there. And when it did, Daniel turned 34 horses around, instead of proving he had the right to continue. Daniel did not come back the next morning. Neither did the horses. At 6:15, Margaret stood at her kitchen window and listened to something she had not heard in 3 weeks. Silence. By 9, Daniel finally called. His tone had changed. The brochure map is conceptual. Margaret set down her coffee. That's not what your salesperson told those buyers. They were being shown the surrounding trail network. Through my pasture? No one said Cross Ridge owns your land. You didn't have to. You brought buyers across it. Daniel paused. The trail connection is still being evaluated. Margaret looked through the window toward the orange stakes. Then explain the markers. What about them? They carry your project code. They were survey references. For a route you claim was only temporary. Another pause. Margaret could almost hear him rearranging the argument. We were studying possible connections. While 34 horses use the same connection every morning, that doesn't create a permanent right. Margaret's eyes narrowed. It was the first thing Daniel had said that she completely agreed with. No, she said. It doesn't. He went quiet. Margaret continued. And that's exactly why the gate is staying closed. Daniel ended the call without another word. 2 hours later, Margaret received an email from one of the prospective buyers she had met in the pasture. Her name was Claire Sutton. She had found Margaret through the county parcel listing. Claire attached a screenshot of a message she had sent Cross Ridge's sales office the previous week. Is the horseback connection to Pine Valley guaranteed with the property? The sales response underneath was short. Direct trail access is part of the Cross Ridge equestrian plan. Margaret read it several times. It still did not say that Cross Ridge legally owned a trail. But it was far stronger than Daniel's new claim that buyers were merely being shown the surrounding area. Claire added one sentence of her own. We were considering Lot 7 partly because of the trail access. Margaret forwarded the exchange to Paul. His response came 10 minutes later. This isn't a property right document, but it shows why the route matters commercially. Exactly. Margaret printed the email and placed it beside the brochure and the survey. The picture was getting clearer. Daniel had not needed to own her pasture to benefit from people believing the route would remain available. As long as the horses crossed every morning, the promise looked real. As long as the gate opened, nobody had reason to question the line on the map. Now the gate was closed, and Daniel had moved from calling the route temporary to calling it conceptual. Margaret looked toward the empty trail. The dispute was no longer about whether 34 horses could cross her grass tomorrow morning. It was about whether Daniel could keep selling an amenity that stopped at a locked gate. 2 business days later, Margaret had 2 different answers from 2 different sources. Paul Mercer handled the first. His completed survey confirmed the property boundary and the location of the old farm track. The historic track crossed part of Margaret's pasture, but it stopped nearly 200 feet before the south gate. It did not create the connection shown on Daniel's development map. The second answer came from a local title company Margaret had asked to review the recorded documents affecting her parcel. The search covered deeds, recorded easements, rights-of-way, and documents tied to the Hale property. The report was careful. It did not declare that no access claim could ever be argued under any legal theory. Easement rules varied by jurisdiction, and a recorded search alone could not dispose of every possible claim based on old deeds, necessity, implication, or long adverse use. But Cross Ridge was not landlocked. Daniel had an eastern alternative on his own property, and the 3-week horse route had begun with Margaret's expressly temporary permission. Most important for the immediate dispute, the search found no recorded trail easement granting Cross Ridge or Daniel's parcel a right to take horses through Margaret's pasture in Outer South Gate. Rebecca reviewed the report and sent Daniel a final demand to stop entering, remove the project stakes, correct any sales representation suggesting secured access, and pay the documented restoration cost. Daniel's attorney did not produce an easement in response. Instead, Daniel came to negotiate. Margaret placed the title report beside Paul's survey. One showed where the old track actually ended. The other showed that Daniel had not produced a recorded right, extending it to Pine Valley. That afternoon, Daniel came to her house. For once, he brought no horses, no riders, and no site plan. He carried a folder. I want to make you an offer. Margaret stayed on the porch. For what? A permanent equestrian easement. There it was. For 3 weeks, Daniel had called the route a temporary detour, then an existing farm lane, then a conceptual connection. Now he was offering money to secure the right to use it. Daniel named a figure. It was substantial enough that Margaret knew he was serious. She still shook her head. You didn't even consider it. I did. You barely use that strip. It crosses an active pasture. We can fence both sides. It passes my livestock water point. We can adjust the alignment. And it runs too close to my working area. Daniel closed the folder halfway. You know I can build another trail. I know. It'll take longer. Margaret nodded. And cost more, yes. She looked toward the eastern side of Cross Ridge. Paul had already explained the alternative. A longer route along Daniel's own side of the development, additional grading, drainage work, and probably an engineered crossing near the ravine. Difficult, not impossible. Daniel studied her. You'd rather make me build all that? I'd rather you build your project on land you have the right to use. His expression hardened. You're making this unnecessarily expensive. Margaret looked toward the south gate. No. My pasture was making your project unusually cheap. Daniel said nothing. That was the real difference. Cross Ridge did not need Margaret's land to survive. It needed her shortcut to preserve the easiest version of the promise Daniel had been selling. And now, for the first time, he was being forced to price that promise correctly. The change appeared on the Cross Ridge website 5 days later. Margaret noticed because Claire Sutton sent her the link. The phrase direct horseback access to Pine Valley riding trails was gone. In its place, future equestrian trail connection under development. The site map had changed too. The clean line through Margaret's pasture had disappeared. Cross Ridge was still selling homes. Construction had not stopped. Crews still worked on roads, utilities, and foundations north of her fence. But one of the project's strongest equestrian promises was no longer being presented as something buyers could already use. Claire called that afternoon. We decided not to reserve Lot 7. Margaret was careful. Because of the trail? Partly. We wanted to ride directly from the property. Claire explained that once she learned the Pine Valley connection had not been secured, the lot no longer fit what she and her husband were looking for. Margaret did not celebrate. She had never wanted buyers to lose money. She had wanted Daniel to stop selling certainty where he had not secured a right. A week later, Paul showed Margaret a preliminary access study Cross Ridge had filed with the county. The new concept stayed off Margaret's parcel. It followed the eastern side of Daniel's property, then curved around the highway edge before approaching the bridle network farther south. The difficult section was near the drainage channel. Before horses could safely use the route, Cross Ridge would need additional grading, drainage design, and likely an engineered crossing. So they're building it? Margaret asked. Not yet, Paul said. They're designing it. That distinction mattered. Permits, engineering, and construction would take time. But Daniel finally had a route that depended on his own project instead of Margaret's gate. There was still the damage in her pasture. 3 weeks of horse traffic had compacted soil and stripped grass along the worn line, especially near the south end. Margaret did not invent a dramatic number. She hired an agricultural contractor to inspect the route, measure the affected area, test the most compacted section, and prepare a written scope for shallow aeration, minor contour repair, reseeding, temporary exclusion, and follow-up establishment. The contractor specifically avoided deep work near the livestock water line and scheduled the repair for suitable soil conditions. Margaret sent the photographs, measurements, invoice, and written estimate to Daniel through Rebecca. His office paid the documented amount 11 days later as part of a written resolution that did not grant Cross Ridge any future access. No apology came with the check. Margaret did not expect one. 2 days after that, Daniel stopped beside her fence. No horses. No riders. No brochure. We're moving forward with the eastern route, he said. Margaret nodded. I heard. It'll delay trail access. That's your project decision. Daniel looked across the recovering pasture. You could have taken the easement money. I could have. And avoided all this. Margaret rested one hand on the fence. No. You could have asked before you started using my land. Daniel looked toward the south gate. For 3 weeks, his shortcut had made Cross Ridge easier to market. Now the development would have to solve its own geography, not by crossing Margaret's boundary, by building around it. Nearly 3 months later, Margaret woke at 6:15 out of habit. For a moment, she lay still. Then she noticed what was missing. No hooves, no bridles, no riders calling through the morning dark. She dressed and walked toward the south pasture. The old trail was still visible, but only if she knew where to look. New grass had filled most of the worn strip, and the worst section near the gate had recovered after reseeding. Margaret stopped beside the fence. For 3 weeks, 34 horses had crossed this ground every morning and returned again later. The repetition had made the route feel normal, then useful, then almost permanent. That had been Daniel's advantage, not ownership, expectation. Far beyond the north fence, work had finally begun on Cross Ridge's eastern trail connection. The route curved along Daniel's own property instead of cutting across Margaret's pasture. County-approved drainage work was underway near the difficult section, and crews were preparing the foundation for the small crossing Paul had predicted months earlier. It was slower, more complicated, and more expensive. But it was a route Cross Ridge could build without depending on Margaret's gate. The homes were still going up. Daniel had not lost his development. Margaret had not won a fortune. There had been no courtroom showdown and no dramatic police arrival. She preferred it that way. The dispute had never needed to become bigger than the boundary itself. Paul stopped by later that morning to look at the restored ground. Hard to believe 34 horses were coming through here twice a day. Margaret smiled. I remember. Paul looked toward Cross Ridge. They should have their new trail finished before the next riding season. Good. He glanced at her. That doesn't bother you? Why would it? You spent months stopping their access. Margaret shook her head. I stopped access through my pasture. What Daniel builds on land he has the right to use is his business. Paul nodded. That was the distinction Daniel had avoided from the beginning. An old farm tract did not automatically give Cross Ridge a connection to Pine Valley. A line on a development map did not create an easement. And driving 34 horses through the same gate every morning did not replace the permission Daniel had never secured. Margaret walked to the south gate. She unlocked it, swung it open to move her own equipment through, then closed it behind her. The gate had never been permanently sealed. It remained part of her farm operation. What changed was who controlled it and for what purpose. She logged the final restoration photographs with the earlier images, stored the title report and survey with her deed, and kept Daniel's written acknowledgement that the settlement created no trail permission. That simple motion felt different now. Daniel had once treated the gate as the only exit his horses needed. Margaret had closed it and forced him to confront the route he had been selling. The gate had never proved that no one could ever claim any right across the land. It proved something narrower and stronger. Daniel Cross had never secured the right he was acting as though he already had. Standing beside the recovered grass, Margaret thought about the 4 years she had managed the farm without her husband. Losing him had forced her to make decisions alone, but it had also taught her not to confuse being alone with being powerless. She had not defeated Cross Ridge, and she had never wanted to. The development remained. Its horses would reach Pine Valley from a lawful route, and future buyers could judge the revised promise honestly. What Margaret protected was smaller than an entire project and more important to her. The authority to decide who crossed her pasture, when they crossed it, and under what conditions. Daniel had relied on repetition to make an unauthorized shortcut feel inevitable. Margaret answered with records, notice, patience, and one locked gate. Once the shortcut disappeared, the truth became simple. His development had always been responsible for solving its own access problem. If you have ever had someone treat your patience like permanent permission, tell us what happened in the comments. Would you have accepted Daniel's easement offer, or would you have made Cross Ridge build its own route? Share this story with someone who believes a repeated shortcut can become a right, and subscribe for more stories where calm decisions, careful records, and clear boundaries change everything.